How do we decide what to do next? On the one hand, we could imagine that the brain, acting as a machine, examines its environment and its own internal state and directs which is going to be our next action. In contrast, we could imagine that there is some kind of mind stuff which can take control of the brain and influence our behaviour. And I'm going to start by giving the mechanistic account, and one which has its origins in trying to unravel a solution to this problem, the problem of action selection, illustrated in this cartoon here, which I hope is somewhat self-explanatory, but I'm going to talk through it to introduce some of the terms which I will use later. So these animals here had a homeostatic imbalance. They were hungry. They therefore had a very high salience or urgency to select the action of feeding. But then they spotted this phasic stimulus on the horizon, otherwise known as the predator. Okay? And the salience for the action of fleeing from the predator acquired a much higher value, and therefore they switched from feeding to fleeing, except of course one poor soul doesn't quite get it, does he? There's always one, isn't there? Which is good for him, otherwise he'd become extinct, yeah? But more formally then, more seriously then, how can we as humans, given this ever-present deluge of sensory information, cognitive state information and homeostatic information, select between appropriate behaviours, given that we can only do one thing at a time? We can only ever do one thing at a time. And so here's how it might play out in the brain. I've shown here 4 possible command centres for 4 possible actions encoded throughout the brain here. And the idea in this scheme is that they just fight it out with each other. They're connected to each other and they just compete with each other to decide who's going to take control of behaviour. In an alternative scheme, these action centres talk into a central switch, shown in that box with the S in the middle, and then this switch permits or allows, releases one of these behaviours to take control of our actions. And amongst other things, there are far fewer longer range connections in this scheme. That may sound rather boring observation, but wire in the brain, i.e. axons, costs energy. And so if we can reduce the energy our brains use, that's a good thing. Okay, here's our hypothesis then, is that there is a central switch in the brain, and it's comprised of this set of subcortical nuclei called the basal ganglia, an evolutionarily very old set of brain systems which are found in all vertebrates going back to primitive fish, highly conserved all the way through evolution to primates and humans. And the idea then is that these action requests from all over the brain make themselves present at the basal ganglia that's listening to these things. These action requests have different saliences, different values, different degrees of urgency, and we choose those actions which have the highest salience at any one time. Now, these action requests can be complex. They can comprise a range of sensory information, homeostatic information, and cognitive or contextual information. And that's where it gets interesting, because in some sense then our context is all of our mental state at this moment in time, which, sure, it depends on our sensory experience, but it also depends on your entire life history. You're all seeing the slides, you're all hearing the words. Are you all having the same experience? No, because you're all bringing something different to bear at this moment in time, which is your entire life's history. And the idea is that that experience can also be brought to bear as context in the action request that you elicit into the competition in the basal ganglia. So all that stuff gets processed through the machine, and in this view anyway, as sure as those dominoes fall one after the other, the machine will decide whether you do one action or another, or indeed whether you have one thought or another. And this isn't so fanciful, because there are connections between prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia, and basal ganglia pathologies have been implicated in deficits with thought disorders such as schizophrenia. So this is not an entirely fanciful idea. Okay, but is this all? Clearly the answer is going to be no. But I should say before I go on to this second part that the neuroscience story has been developed in conjunction with a large number of scientists at my own institution and elsewhere. What follows is my own very personal view and interpretation of the neuroscience. So starting off, we know that there is this subjective experience or sensation that we make the decisions. We're sure of that. We're convinced of that. There's this subjective qualia of consciousness that tells us we are making the decisions. Well, the advocates of the purely mechanistic account are prepared to acknowledge the existence of the conscious experience, but they would say all that's happening is that we are watching the brain make the decisions. It's a sort of post hoc, passive, observational thing that happens after the event. So, in that view then, the hardware of the brain dictates deterministically what the passive observer, the conscious experience here, perceives. But in another view, there is some mind stuff, some mind thing, some non-material thing which can somehow recruit the brain to determine behaviour. We might call this free will. Why do we struggle sometimes, or why do some people struggle with this viewpoint? Well, it's a conceptual leap. But here's an analogy that you might find useful. In the realm of computing, something else dear to my heart, we usually think of the non-material stuff, the software, as causing the operation, the electric currents flowing through the hardware. We don't tend to think of it the other way round. So we're very happy in this domain to conceive of the non-material thing causing changes in the hardware. Perhaps it's not such a leap to think of this arrow in this direction in this context either. Further, are these two completely irreconcilable views? Well, maybe not. Maybe, in fact, a lot of the time we do watch what our brains do. We are passive observers. We're on autopilot. But we can learn to consciously guide our behaviours using our minds. Okay? And is this a new idea? No, it's a very old idea that is found throughout history and across the globe in a whole range of philosophical and spiritual traditions. Here's one of my favourites, actually, from a somewhat controversial thinker from the 20th century, Gurdjieff, who says, "Man is asleep. He has no real consciousness or will. To him, everything happens." He, the passive observer. He can become conscious, but this requires a profound transformation. You've got to earn it. You've got to work hard for it. That is really the verbal summary of my previous slide. It's exactly the same thing. But it's not confined to one or two people like Gurdjieff. Here we have something in the Judeo-Christian tradition. He that ruleth his spirit is mightier than he that taketh cities. This idea, this exhortation to take control of our actions. And in the Hindu literature, when a man has discrimination and his mind is controlled, his senses, like the well-broken horses of a charioteer, lightly obey the rein. Again, it's the same story writ large in different traditions. So, in summary, there's two possible viewpoints. The brain as a machine dictating our actions, in our view, using the basal ganglia as a central switch, or the mind taking control of our behaviours, but maybe it's not one or the other. It is, the question should be, how far along the road are we in developing this will, if you will, and to what extent are our actions executed on this side sometimes, or on this side on other occasions. Thanks very much.